I was 17, I knelt on the turf at Evans Field by the old Canandaigua Academy and led the football team in prayer. After all, I was their quarterback. My adrenaline pulsed when the Star-Spangled Banner was played by that great Academy band. In those innocent days, everyone sang, not murdering the anthem by some pop croon singer. We all sang together. Now that I am an 81-year-old man, I kneel again, not in prayer, but figuratively, in support of my fellow quarterback, Colin Kaepernick. Even those of you who are not football fans, and there may be 2 or 3 of you who are not football fans, know the name of Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback who knelt in the national anthem instead of standing as the other players with hand on heart. He knelt why? To protest racism, to protest police brutality against black citizens. Now, I am retired, and he, unfortunately, is unemployed. But even Donald Trump cannot keep him off the field because Colin Kaepernick has touched the conscience of a nation. I was an unquestioning child of the 50s who believed God uniquely blessed America. I said so over on the hill near Bristol. It was a kind of manifest destiny which played out, unfortunately, in our suppression of Native Americans. Now I am a man who questions this super patriotic ritual every Sunday, or even Thursday nights now, the football games with the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem, a field-sized flag, and then, of course, tax dollar guzzling jets flying overhead. Nevertheless, I continue to be mesmerized by those players whom I tried to emulate when I was a young quarterback at CA. Most of these players are African Americans, many of them showing their patriotism by kneeling or perhaps by joining hands and arms with their fellow players. They are protesting not the flag or the anthem, but racism. For Gunnar Myrdal's American dilemma is still with us. That tension between the American creed of freedom and our historic racism. I am not a racist. Now, I say this not with condescending pride, but because my Universalist theology says something about the inherent worth and dignity of all people. To call one a racist means that is the very essence of their being, and it may not necessarily be so. There are some racists who love their families, who are good in their communities, even though they exhibit racist traits and tendencies and behaviors. Thus, even the Donald Trumps of the world are enclosed in my Universalist circle of love. To be sure, I believe he is a human being who manifests serious, extreme racism. But I know that despite my attempts to transcend it, there resides a certain racism in me. We are all more human than otherwise. And so I live between the tension of my faith in human nature on the one hand, and the racism that affects our society on the other, affects our society and me. I grew up over the hills a few miles in a whites-only rural environment. It was in many ways a Norman Rockwell world, that white privileged bubble of the 1950s. I met a single black friend over on Evans Field. He played tackle to my quarterback. Then I attended the all-white St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. And while there, I failed to follow through an initiative put up by fellow Unitarian Universalists to integrate the university. I was simply too busy at the time. Quotes around too busy. My first civil rights activity was a march in Watertown, New York, to protest segregation at Woolworth department stores because their Board of Trustees was meeting there at that time. This is about 1962. It was an assignment in my social ethics class in seminary. In 1965, I spent time working for the UUA in Suffolk, Virginia, encountering racial segregation for the first time. That year, I attended the memorial service for UU colleague James Reed, who was killed on the streets of Selma, working for voting rights. And I attended the memorial service for Jim, and even was literally brushed by the great Martin Luther King as he moved on his way to the pulpit to deliver the eulogy. One of the high experiences, one of the peak experiences of my life. I returned to Selma in 2005. At the 1968 Cleveland General Assembly, I supported the Black Affairs Council, Black Power in those days. In the first training of my Building Your Own Theology course, I included a story about an Indian attack on a white settler cabin. And only when it was pointed out to me how racist that was did I withdraw it from the first edition. So mine is a very mixed record. As I said, I'm not a racist, but I do know that there are racist tendencies in me. While watching a college basketball game with two colleagues at a ministerial conference one day, one black, one white, I remarked all the players on the University of Michigan team were black. So what? Why had I said that? So I know I have committed microaggressions, comments that reveal that I have not quite got it with racism. I have participated consciously and unconsciously in the white male privilege into which I was born and in which I was educated. Yet for decades I have preached sermon upon sermon advocating for public policies promoting racial justice, and now I live in an integrated neighborhood in a city with a heavily minority population. Yet I am troubled and disturbed. I am not alone in this. Unitarian Universalists are upset about a recent incident at the UUA regarding racism and staffing. You may know the story. I'll summarize it very quickly. The UUA sought a district executive for the Southeast region. Two members of the Board of Trustees were candidates. One, a religious educator, a woman of color. The other, a white male minister. He got the job. In what was a very striking picture for me in the UU World magazine, there was a picture of the Board of Trustees deliberating these two people side by side. She and many others protested that this choice demonstrated the inherent white supremacy, the racism in the UUA. President Peter Morales tried to justify the hiring, noting that great progress had been made in recruiting black leadership in our movement. But then he made an unfortunate comment that there wasn't a significant enough pool of qualified black candidates to fill various leadership jobs. That was fuel for the flame, and protests continued. He resigned, saying someone else would need to lead, as he had not been able to do so himself. There followed the resignation of the chief executive officer and the director of congregational life, who made the hiring decision. There followed the appointment of a trio of co-presidents who served UUA from April, when all this took place, through June, when a new president of the UUA would be elected. So in the wake of having successfully elected a black president, a Hispanic president, and finally a woman of color, a woman president, a white woman, the denomination began an excruciating process of self-examination, soul searching. It is not my job to point the finger of blame or to judge what has happened. I do not know the two candidates for this position, nor the details of the hiring process. I do support affirmative action in aggressively placing people of color in leadership positions within our movement. And I do believe this situation was very poorly handled by the UUA itself. And I, of course, remember the checkered history of our working for social justice over the centuries, alternating between heroic action and incomprehensible racism, especially in our historic exclusion of black people from our pulpits, as so well documented by my friend and colleague, Mark Morrison-Reed. But as Eudora Welty put it, I think so well, my wish, indeed my continuing passion, would be not to point the finger in judgment, but to part a curtain, that invisible shadow that falls between people, the veil of indifference to each other's presence, each other's wonder, each other's human plight. Whatever mistakes have been made, and they are legion, it is not only time to acknowledge those errors, but also to affirm the progress we have made in combating racism in our movement. Last Sunday night at First Unitarian Church in the city, I attended an anti-racism training entitled, "I Am a Good Person. Isn't that enough?" The answer, of course, was no. We are part of a good denomination. Is that not enough? I'm afraid not. Some of us evidently felt that being very racially progressive Unitarian Universalists, there just wasn't anything else to do. How wrong we were. I believe there are racist tendencies in all of us, no matter our background or how hard we try to avoid them. Racism and inequality, I think, are in the very air we breathe, or as one person has put it, in the very ocean in which we swim. Microaggressions, thoughtless words and deeds, and simple ignorance plague us. So it is time to confess those errors, make amends, and continue our stumbling pursuit of justice. We might try to practice what has been called ambition, a new word perhaps, from philosopher Walter Kaufman. Ambition, that combination of humility and ambition, to remain humble before our faults, yet be ambitious in our attempts to rectify them. This is no time for a retreat into what has been called the witch hunt in our own psyches. Well, we do need to probe our racist tendencies as individuals and as a movement and as a nation. Our time and energy must also lead us to heal the fresh brokenness that our country has experienced in these past several months. So let's not get lost in the immediacy of this crisis of our movement so that we ignore the larger crises in our society that unfold day by day. Soul searching must not degenerate into a kind of self-flagellation that submerges us in a kind of debilitating guilt. And while progress has been made in our nation in terms of legal freedoms for people of color and for some economic prosperity, racism is rife despite talk that we all had of a post-racial society in the wake of the election of Barack Obama. I will confess that after I had worked for so many years in passage of civil rights legislation, I thought that this institutional racism was really only a chapter in American history, rather than a persistent theme. I've even come to question Martin Luther King's appeal for America to become colorblind. Of course, we evaluate people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, but this really is not enough. Race matters. And I reluctantly conclude that racism has been far more powerful and persistent than I thought, and even now as the veil of the suppressed racism is now revealed in the current administration. We need continually to be able to view our society through a lens of racial justice. And when we do, we find ourselves wanting. The fact of American racism is given scholarly underpinning in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. She decries the color blindness as a kind of moral myopia which does not see the racism that's embedded in our culture. In her words, the inescapable sea in which we swim. She details the school-to-prison pipeline, which makes inner-city young black men redundant, and documents the devastating impact of the war on drugs on black youth. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, disproportionately black and Hispanic. Racism is given experiential credence in Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, an open letter from a black father to his black son. He writes, I am not a cynic. I love you and I love the world, and I love it more with every new inch I discover. But you are a black boy, and you must be responsible for your body in a way that other boys cannot know. Indeed, you must be responsible for the worst actions of other black bodies, which somehow will always be assigned to you. All my life I've heard people tell their black boys and black girls to be twice as good, which is to say, accept half as much. You have been cast into a race in which the wind is always in your face and hounds are always at your heel. Some of us will make it out, but the game is played with loaded dice. Coates updates his analysis in a recent Atlantic article, The First White President, which argues that Trump won not so much because he appealed to the grievances of working-class whites, but because of a deep-seated racism that permeates so many of those who elected him. He points out that Trump won the white vote at every single socioeconomic level, from the poorest to the richest. And that his victory came with an attempt to erase the legacy of the first black president. Trump, Coates contends, is a white man who would not be president were it not for this fact, that is, of having succeeded a black president. Trump is something new. The first president whose entire political existence hinges on the fact of a black president. And Coates warns that to accept that whiteness brought us Donald Trump is to accept whiteness as an existential danger to the country and the world. Strong words. What to do? First, kneeling. That is, we need to center ourselves religiously, theologically. Get our religious act together, find out what we truly believe, if we really take seriously our values of the inherent worth and dignity of persons, right of conscience, use of democratic process in human relations. All those things we say so frequently in our purposes and principles. And those of us who are white must come to terms with the meaning of white privilege, which is the default world in which we live. Second, knowing. All of us, including myself in this, need to become better informed. Racism is not simple prejudice. It is prejudice plus power, and resides in the structure of society's daily practice and policy. In 1965, when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I did a study of housing discrimination and segregation in the greater Chicago area. And to my surprise, then as a naive person, to my surprise, I discovered it was the result of deliberate national policy put in place after the Second World War. The same can be said for current policies. For example, the Voter Fraud Commission, ostensibly to eliminate fraud in our voting patterns, although that's denied by virtually every expert in voter registration and voting. It really is a solution in search of a problem. The real problem is race-based gerrymandering, and voter suppression across the length and breadth of this land. As we look at our rigged economy, we see more examples of this racism as a conscious policy. The increasing racial and income gap comes from decades of discrimination in employment and housing. Inequitable funding of urban schools has the greatest impact on children of color. That is what the Alliance for Quality Education found in their lawsuit, which they brought forth and won. The reality that New York State has underfunded and still underfunds its most needy districts. Racism is constantly revealed in the disproportionate impact on people of color of this never-ending attempt to repeal and replace Obamacare, and in Donald Trump's draconian, unjust budget. For example, funding for CHIP, the Child Health Program for our low-income children, funding for it has expired thanks to an inept Congress. The plight of migrant workers and danger that rich immigrants face as they try to come to this country simply is one more example of racism at work. And all of this is deliberate public policy. It's no accident, it's quite deliberate. And perhaps the most graphic example of racism, you will recall that there was a plan in the last administration to put Harriet Tubman's image on the $20 bill. Well, now it's up for grabs, and Andy Jackson may continue, even though he was one of our more racist presidents. Finally, third, doing, having the courage to act. There is much we can do to resist increasing racism and escalating inequality. Ta-Nehisi Coates has been criticized and accused of doing nothing but writing about this. Because he writes, he doesn't attend rallies, he's not a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement. In response, he says that he writes because that's what I've got. And in wondering what we might do, we can take note of that response. We cannot do everything, but we can do something with what we've got. And what most of us have is white privilege. A privilege that can be used to leverage power, to work towards some semblance of the beloved community. Whether we be teachers or preachers, doctors or lawyers, plumbers or carpenters, unemployed or retired, each of us is a citizen in this land of the free and the home of the brave. My own particular energy is invested in interfaith impact of New York State, and we address many of these issues I discussed, and shameless plug, shameless commercial, materials back there, along with some books for you to look over. So there's much we can do, but we do it piece by piece, an issue at a time, starting perhaps with a racial audit of our own lives, then an audit of our congregations, moving on to state and nation. To put the issue of racism in a larger context, in April of 2016, Joyce and I visited South Africa. It was my fourth try. I didn't make it the first three. And we met some of the people engaged in the anti-apartheid movement. The Minister Emeritus of the Cape Town Unitarian Church was the mayor of Cape Town when Nelson Mandela was released from imprisonment on Robben Island. And he took us around and showed us important historic places in Cape Town. Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years of imprisonment in Robben Island, just off the coast of Cape Town. And there I learned something of the power of reconciliation. On our visit to Robben Island, we met Chris Dubrant, Mandela's private guard. His fascinating story resulted in a book, Nelson Mandela, My Prisoner, My Friend. What is fascinating is that Mandela helped him to edit that book and provided for his captain, his officer, free legal service. One of our guides on Robben Island had been a prisoner there with Mandela. Well, why would he return to work there with such ghastly memories? I needed a job, he said. But while he was there, he met one of his jailers who had abused him. They took their relationship to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to work out their history and their feelings. Now, our nation is so rife with racism, I'm not sure that we're ready yet for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it's something to which we might aspire. And I mention that to indicate that not everything is possible to do with a legislative fix. That nothing less than a total conversion to justice and equality will bring us again to some semblance of the beloved community. For we live in troubled, if not apocalyptic times. Every day seems to bring some new and awful problem, even if only via Twitter. However hard it is, we find it very easy to become discouraged these days. And so I leave you with a metaphor from Pete Seeger, a great folk singer, who was also a great worker for justice. He created a metaphor. He said, our situation is like a seesaw, with one end anchored to the ground with a huge basket of rocks, the status quo. And on the other end, the upper end, a basket of sand. And there are the activists, putting in a teaspoon of sand at a time in this basket. Someday, Seeger said, the basket will tip, the teeter-totter will tip, the balance will change, and the rocks will be sent flying into the air. And people will ask, how did this happen so quickly? Seeger said, it was because of us and our damn little teaspoon. We are called to lift a prophetic voice and speak truth to power. And as we look at the big picture, the American Dilemma 2017, we need to remember that while not all are guilty, all are responsible. As Martin Luther King reminded us, there is a time when silence is betrayal. The time is always right to do right. I invite your participation once more. Let the congregation say, Amen. Amen.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.